This week's mystery is an interesting one, because it manages to combine a story I translated just recently for Kawabana's 31 Days of Spooktober, and a Japanese book about the history of curses in Japan that I was coincidentally reading at the same time. Let's dive in and take a look at this one. As you no doubt already know if you're here, Nii-chan is no stranger to creepypastas, and they're generally presented as true tales. Even if the people reading them know that they're nothing more than fake stories to begin with. They're presented as real, and the anonymous nature of Nii-chan certainly helps keep that facade up. In 2006, an anonymous poster shared a story in a thread titled "Strange and Scary Stories Set in the Mountains." I won't cover the whole story here as it just went up on the Patreon yesterday, but essentially it's the story of a young man who is working on his graduation thesis for university. He's a geology student in Shikoku, and he spends his time out in the mountains measuring the topography and creating his own maps. The scary part comes in when this geology student finds a village in the mountains that isn't listed on any of the official maps, and he discovers there are no roads leading in or out of this mysterious village. Worse, he finds what looks like little crucifixes made with chopsticks that have paper figures attached to them all stuck in the ground outside the community hall, and the villagers scream and chase after him once they realise he's there. A while later, a younger student in the same field, who is now writing their own graduation thesis, asks him to look over it. He realises this student found the same village he did, only this time the place was littered with old Japanese-style toilets, confusing both of them. It's confirmed once again that, when seen from the top of the mountain, there's no road leading in or out of the village. So how these villagers managed to live there and why it became such an odd dumping ground is unknown. This particular story didn't become a massive hit, but it became well known enough that people started to debate where this mystery Shikoku village could be, and why it might be so isolated. The story describes the villagers as angry and chasing the poster down when they see him, which is probably to be expected if you suddenly notice a stranger in your village far away from civilization. But Nii-chan being Nii-chan, is there any truth to this story? Was the mysterious village real? Or, at the very least, was the story based on something real? As it turns out, it just might have. As I mentioned earlier, I've been reading a book called Noroi to Nihonjin. This translates to Curses and Japanese People, and it's an in-depth look at the custom of curses in Japan, how they came to be and how they're performed in various locations around the country. And in particular, it focuses on one village in Shikoku that's said to follow a very old sect of Onmyodo called the Izanagi School. This village is called Manobe Village, and it's a very real place. But how does it tie to the story? Well, let's take a look. The Izanagi School is, to make a long and complicated history very short, an offshoot of Onmyodo from Japan's Middle Ages. It continued all the way up until present times in this village, isolated from the rest of civilization, and the practitioners, known as tayu, do not use ritual tools, but rather various types of gohei for their ceremonies. These are the white pieces of paper you often see Shinto priests waving about, attached to branches. The particular shapes used for these gohei are different to traditional Shinto ones and often resemble human shapes attached to thin pieces of bamboo. Sound familiar? Manobe Village exists deep in the mountains of Shikoku. It was once prosperous with a population of over 11,000 people, but by the early 2000s that had dwindled to just a few thousand. There's said to be even less people there today, and it's likely that the village's terribly inconvenient location means that it will eventually die out and become abandoned. But there are still people living there right now. In fact, one Twitter user documented his travels to the village just last year. He mentioned running into an old lady who was said to live alone there, and he documented, with photos, just how he reached the village. There are paths in, of course, but it seems near impossible to reach directly by car, and once you've reached a certain limit, you need to walk the rest of the way in. This all ties in with the Nichan story. A mysterious village in Shikoku. No visible roads in or out. Few people, but enough to chase a stranger out. Weird paper figures tied to sticks that are stuck in the ground. Whether it's true or not, it's clear at this point that the story is at least trying to refer to Manobe Village. It should be pointed out here that Manobe Village is hardly a little-known place. As I said earlier, I'm reading a book that has dedicated a large section to exploring the Izanagi school that lives only here, and for such a tiny village, it even has its own Wikipedia page. It's especially well known amongst occult circles, so it shouldn't be too much of a surprise to see a Nichan story pop up that's at least based on it. Now, what about the part about the Japanese-style toilets being dumped around the village? I must admit, the first time I read the story, I was confused, and apparently I wasn't alone on that either. It's a random event that doesn't seem to have ties to anything, and it's never explained either. There are just empty toilet bowls littering the village, and that's that. Yet a little digging reveals that this may actually have a basis in something else. Something fictional, anyway. Nichan users did a little digging into this strange incident, and numerous posters recalled reading a manga that had a scene similar to this. Although they couldn't place it, one user remembered seeing scenes of a man being dragged into a small cabin in the mountains, and when he escaped, he found all sorts of Western-style toilets lying around the place, with a single Japanese-style one mixed in. Whether this particular manga existed or not, it turns out that there is a comic that likely influenced this part of the Nichan story. Volume 5 of The Shape of Happiness features a scene in which some characters visit a lake in Gunma Prefecture. They stay at a rest house, and when they leave, they find the area littered with countless Japanese-style toilets. This is obviously strange and disturbing, and they realize that a man is looking at them from the bushes nearby. This is followed by a crowd of naked men rushing the rest house, dragging a limbless man on a rope behind them. The point of this is obviously to be confusing, disturbing, and at least a little terrifying. Who wouldn't be bewildered by the sight of a crowd of naked men running past a toilet graveyard, dragging a limbless body behind them? It's likely that this is where the Nichan poster took their inspiration from, although it doesn't work quite so well the second time around and feels tacked on at the end to add another level of confusion to the story. Regardless of how you feel about it, it's likely that this manga, published way back in 1994, was the inspiration for that part. Is the story itself true? Highly unlikely. The people of Manobe Village aren't savages who chase strangers out. In fact, they often welcome them to join in their festivals and learn about their old ways. Nor is their village littered with old toilets. But was it the inspiration for the story? There's no doubt on that part, and this can be seen all the way down to their unique gohei that the Izanagi school priests make. It's not unusual for Nichan stories to take a real event or location and spin that into a story. And that's likely what happened here too. The inclusion of the toilets is bizarre, but it also appears to have come from a real source as well. After all, don't the best stories mix their influences? But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll also leave a link to a Japanese video you can check out if you're interested in seeing a little more of Manobe Village and the Izanagi school. Thanks guys, and I'll see you again next time.